welcome to today's session. My name's Kendra Bosworth, which a few of you will know by now because you've been to a number of these webinars. I'm the Manager of Professional Development and Programs at ACSL, and I'll be facilitating this session. I recognise that I'm facilitating this session from the Gundungurra country and the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you're all joining from today. We honour the First Nations peoples' culture and connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. ACSL also acknowledges the lifelong trauma of abuse victims and survivors and their families. The failure of the Catholic Church to protect, believe and respond justly to children and adults at risk, and the consequent breaches of community trust. Please be aware that this session may contain content you find confronting. Matt is going to be talking about sexual abuse. If you start to feel distress, please use your own judgment and ensure you're safe. It is okay to withdraw if you need to, physically or psychologically, and you can find support resources on the ACSL website. Today, I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Matt Casey. Matt is a former Detective Inspector and Head of School of Investigation and Intelligence at the New South Wales Police Academy. He has an extensive background in the investigation of child abuse and sexual assault. After leaving policing, Matt worked in the community sector as a counsellor and restorative practice consultant, and with others developed a mode of practice informed by the application of affect script psychology to the principles and practice of restorative justice. He has worked for the Catholic Archdiocese of Canberra and Goulburn in faith formation and parish support, and managed the Archdiocesan Institute for Professional Standards and Safeguarding. He now provides ad hoc services to various church entities around safeguarding and is a member of the Australian Catholic Review and Appeals Panel. So Matt will be doing most of the talking today, but we do need to hear from you. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to add them to the chat throughout the session. Matt is very happy to take questions through the session if they're related to the slide. So if you have a question, please either type it into the chat or type your name and you can ask the question of Matt, or we will take questions at the end. The aim is that Matt is going to be talking for about an hour, and then we will have questions through till 11:30. So with all that being said, I'd like to welcome Matt.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here and lovely to see so many people. Thanks very much, Kendra. So the subject of today is about responding restoratively to complaints of sexual abuse. And underneath it, what I'm talking about is the significance of explicit practice and the right conversation. Just a little bit of background on that. When I was still in the coppers, one of the things we started looking at was the literature around policing, and we wanted what we did to be explicit. So we needed to be able to explain what we were doing at that particular time, why we were doing that particular thing, and point to the evidence that that particular thing worked. So when I talk about explicit practice, that's what I'm talking about. And what I want to present to you today is a practice that's informed by well-developed and well-researched psychological theory. And the particular theory that I'm talking about is Sylvan Tompkins' affect script psychology. So if we could just move on to that's what I'm about. And if we can just move on to the first slide. When I was thinking about this, I looked at what the Royal Commission had asked us, had said was the way we should look at redress. Now, the Royal Commission, I've got some great friends who are lawyers, and I love them all. But the Royal Commission provided us in a lot of ways a legalistic response. I'm not disagreeing with it at all. But what they said was, what we need to focus on is a direct personal response, counselling and psychological response, and monetary payments. Now, I believe that when we're looking at counselling and psychological response, that's what we get professionals for. And when we're looking at monetary payments, that's what we get lawyers for. They're lawyers, our lawyers, and we work together to provide a fair and reasonable outcome. But if we're looking at a direct personal response, the question is, what does that need to look like? So if we could just go to the next slide, please, Kendra. The US Bishops' Conference suggests that the role of the Catholic Church is to be an instrument of God's work in the world. Now, in that context, what should a direct response, personal response, look like? Now, just on that, I don't know if any of you know a guy named Andy Mullins. Andy used to be a school principal in Sydney. I think he's retired now, but I was listening to a talk Andy gave one time, and he talked about a teacher friend of his who was dying. And Andy went to see him, and it turned out Andy saw him a couple of days before he died. And when he walked into the room, the guy was in bed and his wife was there. And she said, oh, look, Brian, Andy's here. And Brian looked up, looked straight at Andy and said, students should see the face of Christ in their teachers. Now that's always stuck with me. So when I started working in this field, if we could go to the next slide, I started to think about what we need to do at every level when we're doing this sort of work is provide the people with an experience of the love of God. So when we are doing in every response we provide, our focus needs to be first and foremost on providing an experience of the love of God, because what else are we there for? So if we could just hit the button again, what would a restorative response around these sorts of complaints, what would that look like? What's a restorative response, and what do we know about restorative practice? Well, in simple terms, in a normal system, we tend to ask what happened, who's to blame, what punishment or sanction is needed. Now, that's the way a whole lot of things work. But in a restorative system, we're asking what happened, what harm's been done, and what needs to happen to make things right. So if you can see the difference, what happened is about the past, what harm's been done is about the future, is about the present, and what needs to happen to make things right takes us into the future. So when we look at a restorative response, and I just want to go to a little bit of background on that. When I got out of the coppers, I went into the community system, but I also started working with what is now the International Institute of Restorative Practice, their Australian arm, with the guy named Terry O'Connell, who was the father of restorative justice in Australia. And we started on a project that was about domestic violence, safety planning for women. And we wanted to approach it restoratively. So we actually thought we'd run a whole lot of conferences. Well, in the end, we didn't, and for a whole range of reasons. Of course, families weren't around, people had moved from some other town to our town. And but what we found was that when we focused on these things and specifically had a deliberate conversation with people, we found that the more we engaged them restoratively, the less we even needed a conference. So one of the other important things, if we go to the next slide, please, Kendra, is that any process we engage in must be fair. So we're not in the happiness business, actually, and that's where we sometimes make a mistake. We're not in the happiness business. What we're in is the fair process business. Now, my question to you is, when is somebody likely to accept an outcome that he or she doesn't like? And what's more important, process or outcomes? Now, that's an interesting question, because often you'll ask it and you ask people what's more important, process or outcomes, and people will say, well, the outcome's important. But, when you think about it, we're not in charge of the outcome, are we? When We investigate somebody when somebody comes along to us with a complaint. The only thing we can control is the process, because we might reach a conclusion that that person doesn't like. But if we could just go to the next slide. Kim and Morborn, this is worthwhile having a look. It's pretty old now, but it's worthwhile if you want to hunt it down to read what they have to say, that people are most likely to trust and cooperate freely with systems, whether they themselves win or lose, when fair process is observed. So what's fair process? If we could just go to the next slide, please, Kendra. Fair process involves three things these Kim and Morgan have identified. They've identified engagement, explanation, and expectation clarity. Now, what does that mean? That means that we engage them. That means that we explain to them what we're going to do, and we explain, and we have provide them with a very clear expectation of how we will go about things. And that, see, we might have an engagement with somebody over a long period of time. So that expectation clarity that we're going to establish the way we do stuff, and we're going to do that on every occasion, is very important. Now, if I could just move on to the next question there. What are the benefits of when we're going to engage somebody? I remember going into a meeting one time, and it was a training course, and I was talking to a number of students, and I put a situation to them. Look, you're in your office, and somebody comes into you and says, "There's a woman in the next room, and she's just, she's trying to escape from a violent relationship." And I said, "Well, that's, yeah." And, I said, "That's the situation. Now you're going to go in and talk to her. What are you going to do?" And everyone talked about, "Oh, we're going to empower, or we're going to do this, we're going to this." I said, "Well, that's terrific. What's that look like? Like, what are you going to say when you get in there?" And what people started to realise, that they were going to go in with the best of intentions, but actually they're winging it in terms of what they're going to say or what they're going to do. So what we focused on was asking the right question. So my question to you is, what are the benefits of asking questions? If you base your practice on asking questions, what questions are likely to help you engage others? Now, why do I talk about asking questions? I've spent a lot of time dealing with people in very difficult circumstances, probably what I did for a large part of my life. Now, what I found it, like, if we want to, round someone up about what they did, like, we've all got kids. I know with my kids, they come in, "Now, I dare to tell you, you've done this," and it's real easy for somebody just to switch off. But if you ask them a question, they've got to engage with you. What happened? So I was actually in a judiciary hearing only a few days ago, where I had two fellas who'd got in a fight, and two people got in a fight on a basketball court, and it was pretty outrageous, actually. And so when I sat down with them at the hearing, one bloke wanted to tell me about what the other guy did, and I let him go for a bit, and then I stopped and said, "Well, that's terrific. I'm going to let him tell me his story, but what I want to know from you is what happened. And what I'm interested in is what you did, and what you were thinking at the time." And when he told me that, "What have you thought about since?" Uh, uh, and he went, "Oh, it's pretty stupid. What do you think needs to happen now? Who's been affected?" He said, "Look, I had my kids there." Oh, goodness me. "What do you think needs to happen now?" So I took him on a bit of a journey, but see, he was engaged. If I had just responded to him by telling him to shut up or keep down and don't yell at me, that sort of thing, that wasn't going to be very helpful. Now, what I want you to do is have a look at a set of questions in the next slide. These questions here, what do you notice about these questions? What happened? what did you think when you realised this had happened? How's this impacted on you and others? What's the hardest thing for you? And what do you think needs to happen to make things right? If you notice, these questions, again, take us from the past, what happened? What did you think when you realised this had happened? Into the present, how's this impacted on you and others? And what's the hardest thing for you? And then we're looking at the future. Now, I just want to give you an example of this. I was interviewing a woman who was about 35 years old one time, and she came, a long story, but she ended up with me over an incident that had happened where a priest many years ago, when she was alone in the church with him, put his arm around her neck when she was 9 years old and started to nibble on his ear, on her ear. And then he did it again later on when they were in the sacristy on another occasion. Now, I asked her what happened, and she told me. And I said, what did you think when you realised this was happening? And I suddenly realised I was talking to the 9-year-old girl, not the 34-year-old, 35-year-old woman. I said, well, what did you think when you realised this was happening? And do you know what she said? She said, I thought to myself, what would people think of me if they walked in now and saw this? And she was sobbing. And I said, how's this impacted you and others? And she told me all about how its constant impact had been on her and on her parents. And what's the hardest thing for you? And she told me how it had impacted her life even today, how she was paranoid around her own kids, how she struggled going to church. She still wanted to believe, but she struggled. And that was the hardest thing, was it impacted so much on her and her faith and her family. Now, when I got to what do you think needs to happen, she said, I need to be sure that this won't happen to anyone else. Now, can I tell you, what's fascinating around that is our conversation actually lasted about, oh, good heavens, we had to go into some more detail after that, but we were there for about an hour and a half. And she said to me, when she finished, and she was completely, completely broke down. And so I, had to make sure before she left that she was calm. Now, she went away and she came back to see me a couple of weeks, about 3 weeks later. And I'd been doing other things in the meantime around this matter. But she came in and spoke to me and she said, do you know what, Matt? I said, what's that? She said, it took me 5 days to get over my conversation with you. I said, did it really? And she said, yes. She said, I felt completely drained. And I said, goodness me. She said, but it was what you said to me afterwards that really got to me. And I said, what's that? And I remembered then that when she finished telling me a story, I said to her, I said, my goodness me, what a dreadful thing happened to you. And she just sobbed, absolutely sobbed. And I said, just waited. And she said, thank God. She said, I always thought no one would believe me because it was him. And then I thought, even if they believe me, they're going to go, well, that wasn't much. Because, it was the low end of sexual offending. I'd spoken to the coppers, they weren't interested in it. But what I'd done was given her the opportunity to express the emotion. Now, she said it took 4 or 5 days to get over it, but she said it was a wonderful 4 or 5 days because it was all left behind. All this she had welling up in all that time was behind her. Now, so when you look at those questions, they're factual questions. What happened? What did you think when you realised this was happening? How's this impacted on you and others? They're facts. You can tell, people can tell you that. But if you notice the other thing, they're deliberately designed to evoke emotion. Terry O'Connell was the guy with a few others that developed this. Now, Terry's always told me that he didn't sit down and do focus groups. What he did was ask the wrong questions so many times. He said, I'm a bit of a slow learner. He said, but eventually I worked out the right questions. And the right questions were one that expressed emotion. Now, why is that important? Let's have a look at what things mean for people. You can go into some huge arguments sometimes and realise that it's about the littlest thing, but it's the emotion that's really made it. Now, why is it important to allow someone to express emotion, even strong emotion? And just on that, I just want to go to something else. I've had some cases where there'd been a lot of abuse in a school where I live, around the Christian Brothers. I spoke to the Archbishop and he asked me to reach out through the network to anyone who'd been abused. He said, I got nothing to do with it. Like, he has no control over the Christian Brothers, but he said he wanted just to let them know that this was his archdiocese and that he was praying for them and he cared for them. Now, I reached out and we ran a few groups and there was some wonderful things came out of it. But one guy gave me a ring one day and I went to see him. And turned out I was in the town he was in. I said, mate, I'm just up the road from you. And we had a talk and he said he'd like to talk to me. So I met him when he's in his office when business closed that night. And the funny part was I knew him, had an associate, didn't know him real well, but knew him well enough. And went in to talk to him. Now, our I used this framework to speak to him. The interesting thing was that after we talked for about 3 hours, and it was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. He was able to express a whole lot of emotion, and we talked, like at a really genuine level. And when we finished, I got up to shake his hand and said, thanks very much. And he gave me a huge hug, really big hug. And he said, thanks very much, Matt. That's been marvellous. Thank you for coming to see me, but never effing come to see me ever again. I thought, said, righto, mate, I won't effing do that. Now, and he smiled and I smiled. I wasn't put back by the really strong emotion that he'd expressed. What I realised was he needed to do it. He enjoyed the opportunity for me to engage with him. He enjoyed the opportunity to tell his story, but he didn't want anything further to do with the church. And that's his right. Now, using these questions enables people to express the emotion. And what I'd like to do is go to the next slide and explain this to you. When I got into the work of restorative justice, it was when I was still in the coppers and Terry introduced me to it. And I knew intuitively that it worked because it always worked on the basis. I remember my father told me years ago, you get more flies with honey. And a detective sergeant that I learned a lot from as a young detective, he explained to me, he said, mate, the deal is when you're talking to crooks, he said, man, the idea is get them crying. And then if you can put your arms around them and shed tears with them, they'll tell you anything. And what he was telling me, I realise now, was get them to share emotion with you. And you reciprocate it and you've made a connection to them. Now, I was interested in why restorative justice worked, and I was introduced to the work of Sylvan Tompkins. Now, just an aside, I really was impressed with Sylvan's work, got right into it. I ended up being a a member of the Sylvan Tompkins Institute, or the Tompkins Institute, which is based in Philadelphia. And for quite a number of years, in fact, I'm just finishing up on the board of that organisation, and I've been involved with it now for around 25 years, and I've studied a lot about it. What Sylvan Tompkins argued was he produced a theory of cognition, emotion, and personality. And he said our emotions are connected to our physicality, to ourselves. And he developed an idea. Well, he developed the theory that each one of us, when we're born, is born with 9 innate affects. If we could just hit the button and put those rest of them up, please. The 9 affects, 2 positive affects. Why only 2 positive affects? Because we need more ways of telling us, of being able to work out what's wrong when something's going wrong. Now, what he said was that an affect is a physical change that occurs in our body, in our skin and our muscles, and it turns on or amplifies an emotion. So the 2 positive affects are interest through to excitement and enjoyment through to joy. And then there's one called surprise startle. And that's where if we're in a room, we're talking to other people and suddenly something falls out of the ceiling, we'll jump, our minds actually go blank. And our body prepares itself for whatever has to happen next. So that surprise interrupts any other affect that's on, surprise startle, and enables us to reset, get ready for what's going to happen next. Then there's 6 negative affects: distress through to anguish, anger through to rage, fear through to terror, dismay, and disgust. Now, they're the only 2 that are just one word. Dismay was the phrase or the word that Tompkins coined to explain. It's the affect that stops us putting something in our mouth that would kill us. For example, you go to have a cup of tea and you grab the milk and your face does these ones. You can't even get it, your head goes back. You can't even get it near your mouth. And disgust is when you've ingested something, turns out to be bad, so we're casting it out. The way I explain that a lot is little babies, mum feeds them, they're on the breast, they're on the bottle, whatever it is, and then the time comes for solid food, and mum starts with some soft food, and what's the baby do? What are you doing, mum? His tongue comes out, they spit it out like heavens. So disgust is that. But the interesting thing that Tompkins also posited was that these are the affects of divorce. They're the affects of relationships. So if we look, for example, at, I've done a lot of couples work. So when we're talking to a couple and the couple, somebody will say, oh, I just can't stand the perfume she wears, is expressing dismay or disgust at that, or she said, it turns my stomach when he touches me. I know that the relationship's over. I'm just helping them sort out the mess. Dismay and disgust are the affects of that. They're also the affects of racial intolerance and racial prejudice. If you think about racial prejudice, often expressed in terms of stinking whatever race I don't like today. Those are the affects of racial prejudice. They're also, and one of the reasons for that is depending on what foods we eat, we smell different. So that dismay comes out. But dismay and disgust are there. And then the last one is shame through to humiliation. Now, if we could just go to the next slide, please. Tompkins argues that shame occurs whenever anything partially interferes with our experience of the positive affects. Now, I just want to talk to you about this. If we could just go to the next slide, shame is the central social regulator that governs how we interact with one another. It interrupts us feeling good, and it provides a sudden awareness of something we really didn't want to know about ourselves. If we could just go back to the previous slide, please. When, like, Tompkins argued that affects are physical. Like if we see someone or someone smiles at us, we can tell someone's happy because it shows in their face. We can tell they're sad because it shows in their face. We can tell if they're angry because it shows in their face. We can tell if they're distressed. We can also see that in their face. What physically happens to us when shame occurs? Think about it. Shame, we're like what happens? Actually, the head drops. We get quiet. Why does the head drop? Well, the head actually drops because shame takes away the muscle tone in our, everywhere actually, but in our neck and shoulders. So the head goes down. That's an example of shame. Now, I'm not saying ashamed. Shame occurs, for example, when I'm out watching Cronulla play, and I love watching Cronulla play, and somebody has a kick at goal, one of the Cronulla guys, and he misses. Shame occurs. There's a partial interruption to my experience of the positive affects. Get a bit back to that later on. When shame occurs, and the other bit, when we go to the next slide, shame is the essential social regulator that governs how we interact with one another. Let's think about how we use shame positively when we're bringing up our kids. We're talking to our kids and, you hear it all the time. Mummy doesn't like it when you do that. Or dad talking to a boy, mate, I was a bit disappointed by that happened. That's using shame positively. I still value you, I just didn't like what you did. Now, when shame occurs, and my example for this is when shame occurs, what's a positive response look like? Now, the best way I can think about this, I love playing golf. So I spend a lot of time on the golf course, and I see shame all the time because I'll see someone hit a ball, instead of a ball soaring majestically down the middle of the fairway, it's over there. It's, didn't go anywhere. What affect occurs? Shame. Now, what would an appropriate response look like? Well, an appropriate response would be to work out that, I didn't hit it properly. That doesn't change me as a person. So I'll go over and line up and make sure the next shot's a good one. But when we don't do that, what do we do? If we could just go to the next slide too, please. When shame occurs, Don Nathanson, who was one of the people who Professor Nathanson started the Tompkins Institute, he says that when shame occurs, we attack others. He said everyone in the world does this. We attack others, we attack self, we withdraw, or we avoid. Now, everyone from Pope Francis to the Dalai Lama does this. They just get out of it quicker than other people because they're pretty together sort of guys. But if we could go to the next slide, you might have to hit it a few times, this one. When we look at shame, blaming, attacking others, blaming or physically or verbally lashing out at other people or things. So you see blokes bang clubs on the ground or scream at someone who's 3 fairways away, or, blame someone instead of just accepting I've hit a bad shot. I often argue that we ricochet or we catapult out of attack self into attack others. Attack self is when we self-put down, doubt, loathing, blaming ourselves. I've seen blokes do, I'm hopeless. I don't know why I play this game, attacking themselves. Or I've had people that say, that's it, and walk off, so they've gone into withdrawal. Or then there's avoidance. Withdrawal is completely walking away from it. My mate Billy Curry reckons that when we look at suicide, it's the ultimate withdrawal. And when we go into suicide a bit, we can see where Don Nathanson's coming from. But avoidance, alcohol, drugs, sex, workaholism. I've dealt with a lot of people who are experiencing marital difficulties, and I see that with one or other of the partners, it's about drugs or alcohol even just spending as much time as you can at work. Now, I just want to show you the next slide. If we could go to that and just hit them all till they're up, if you could, please, Kendra. One day I was interviewing a little boy. His mum brought him in. There'd been drama at school, and the kid he was already on an internal suspension. He'd seen a kid he didn't like, and so he went out and started pegging rocks at him, oblivious to the fact the kid was walking along with the teacher. Now, I was talking to this boy, realised he couldn't. He was only 9. He didn't have the language to be able to describe everything to me. So I got out the St Luke's Innovative Resource Centre bear cards. And I said, mate, when's life good? He said, when mummy and daddy were together. I said, oh, right. When mummy and daddy were together, what cards did you pull out? And he pulled out bear cards that were happy, funny. I said, righto. I said, mate, this morning, when you started pegging rocks at Nathan, are there cards there that showed me what you felt like? And I couldn't believe what he did. He didn't pull them out in this order, but he pulled out mad. He pulled out sad. He pulled out with one with the bear looking away. And I said, what's that one? He said, I don't know, but I felt like that. And then he pulled out the one with the bear walking away. And I said, what's that? He said, I felt like that too. And what I realised is he described to me the compass of shame. Now, I hung on to that. The next time I was dealing with a little fella, I went through the same process and I got exactly the same results. And then my colleague, Anne Burton, she said, just before you felt all those things, is there a bear that shows what you felt like? And he said, yeah. He said, the crumple one. Big smile on his face, the crumple one. He pulled that out, the shame bear. So what he described, and these two boys, now, all those other things that are there, that's what kids said to us when we went through this process. So what we absolutely did, in my view, was went a step towards proving what Don Nathanson had argued, that we go into the compass of shame. Now, why is that important? Because if we want, we've got to recognise where people are at. And oftentimes when we're dealing with these things, whether we're talking to the victim, whether we're talking, or a survivor, whether we're talking to a witness, not that you've got terribly many of them, but even when we're talking to an offender who's actually owning up to it, this is where they're at. Now, if we could just go to the next slide, please. Tompkins argued that we're wired as human beings, the way God made us, is that we're wired to want to increase positive affect, decrease negative affect. We live best when we can accomplish these goals. And anything that increases our power to do this favours life. Now, what he wasn't saying was go out and take drugs, go out and drink grog. And he wasn't suggesting that. He said we're wired to want to do these things. And the more we can increase positive affect and decrease negative affect, the better off we are. Now, if we could just go to the next slide, please. Vic Kelly, a good friend of mine, and Vic Kelly suggested this, drawing on Tompkins' work, that relationships and bonds are built and maintained by sharing and minimising negative affect, sharing and maximising positive affect, allowing affect and emotions to be ventilated, and doing anything that enables the above points to happen. Now, how do we do that? We do that by talking. So when you look at the questions that I outlined for you before, and if anyone's interested, I've got these questions on a card that I'm happy to provide to people. Little cost for those things. But the questions, what happened? What did you think when you realised what had happened to you? what impacts this had on you and others were actually allowing the person to express emotion. Now, why is expressing emotion important? I've got to say, blokes are generally not very good at this. We want our sons to be 10 foot tall and bulletproof, but women sort of do it naturally. So if a woman's struggling, her friends actually pick at her until she tells them she tells them what's wrong. And then everyone gets sad and there might be some tears, but she actually feels better because she shared her story. And the same thing happens to blokes if you can get them to do it. So by sharing emotion, we can minimize negative affect. Telling our story is positive because it gets it out there and we feel better. And then we can share and maximize positive emotion. Now, the important thing to do is allow affect and emotions to be ventilated. We as a society don't actually do conflict very well. We get worried about things, and a thing we're really frightened of is strong emotion. Now, I don't mind that at all, to tell you the truth. Little example, I got a phone call from some friends one day asking me if I could come and referee some basketball, wheelchair basketball. And I said, oh, yeah, that'll be fine. When do you want me to do that? And they said, tomorrow. And I said, all right, where's that at Wodonga? So I had a 4-hour drive to get there. So we jumped in the car and went down there, and I refereed a couple of games, and it's like ordinary basketball, just they were in wheelchairs. And I was enjoying it. I was working with the kids, and then I got to do a game that had a whole lot of athletes in it who were actually vying for national selection. And it was terrific. These were genuine stars. And I really enjoyed the game, except the other referee, I've never seen a referee behave like that. But it was dreadful the way she spoke to players. And I spent my whole game trying to clean up after her. Anyway, I went to the referees coordinator after the game and said, look, mate, I'll go back to doing the kids, so I don't want to experience that again. He said, righto, Matt. So I'm refereeing the kids, and 2 games later, you wouldn't believe it, I get her again, and she's doing all the same things. And it was driving me mad. And, shouting at kids. And one little fella that his response to everything was smile. She was giving it to him about smiling and tick fouling him and that. And then at halftime, she picked a fight with a bloke on the sideline, and I'd had enough. And I was going to talk to her in the referee's room afterwards, but I didn't. I thought, no, I've had enough of this. So I went over to her right then and there and said, listen, Cheryl, this needs to stop. Your behaviour's atrocious and it's really hurting a lot of people. Now, she could have said, oh, gee, thanks, Matt. She didn't, strangely enough. Instead of that, listen, you fat 4-eyed heap, and got right into me. Well, what effect occurred for me, Shane? And where was I going? Yeah, well, I'll get a word in, I'll go on. And then I realised, like, I'm this big and she's not very big at all. And I thought, and then I realised, mate, this is shame. So I was able to think about it, like, consciously, and think, no, when somebody's abusing you, this is what I thought, she's expressing shame. Now, when somebody's abusing me, who are they telling me about? They're telling me about themselves. Do I have to feel bad because they're having a bad day? Well, I might feel sorry for them, but instead of that, I put my hands up and said, look, sorry. The subject of the conversation's your atrocious behaviour. Once we've dealt with that, I'd be really happy to share your insights on my weight, my poor eyesight. I wasn't taking any of her rubbish either. She just revved up more, and I just didn't get upset. I just said, no, please, look, can we just focus on the subject of the conversation and then address those things? And eventually, she did the only thing that was left to her, completely in the compass. She withdrew. Now, the referees coordinator came over to me and said, Matt, look, we'll stop the game. I said, no, just get another referee. We'll be right. I wasn't upset. I realised, in fact, I felt a bit sorry for her. But because I knew about this, I knew where I was going. Now, that's what I'd like to do now, is that explains why the questions work. There's also questions I use when I'm talking to somebody who's done the wrong thing that are: what happened? What were you thinking about at the time? What have you thought about it? Who's been affected by what you did? And what needs to happen now? So they're same, but I want to get the person to talk. Now, if we could just go to the next slide and just hit all the buttons, if you could, please. When I'm talking about a restorative framework and the right conversation, I'm talking about using restorative theory. I'm talking about Socratic engagement. I'm talking about a relational style where I'm having a conversation, using fair process. And if I do all those things, I'm focused on creating conditions where we can manage shame. So when I talk about the right conversation, that's what I'm talking about. Now, I've been talking for a long time. I'm happy to listen to any questions, or if somebody wants me to go over something a bit more, really happy to talk about that.
Matt, it's Bernie Sandell from the Diocese of Wagga Wagga.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Reflecting on those 5 questions, and you were talking about situations where you were also kind of mediating between parties, and you mentioned at one stage you wanted to know, what did you do? How does that fit into the 5 questions? So would you start off with what happened, and then would you also ask to understand, and what did you do if that was relevant in that particular situation, and then go on to the other 4 questions?
When I talked about what did you do, in that particular occasion, it is relevant. See, what I use in my whole counselling practice, and when I'm working with victims, I use the questions as my framework. There might be other questions I need to ask that clarify things, but in the main, I can use those questions. Like somebody might explain something to you, you go, what happened then? Or something like that. My question to that guy, what did you do, was to him, he wanted to talk to me about what the other bloke did. I wanted to talk to him about what he did. And that was in that stage where I had to ask that, what did you do? And well, I punched him in the head. Yeah, good, thanks very much. That now we've got that part out, I could start talking on him, was talking about what he did. But I always revert to the questions that enable him to express the emotion in a way that it's about his own experience. When I'm talking to somebody, like I'll give you, for instance, I've done a lot of work with women who've been victims of domestic violence. And I've said, people come in to talk to me, and there might be a long history of this within this relationship or within previous relationships. And so I've said to people, well, what do you think needs to happen? And they start telling me about what everyone else needs to do or what he needs to do. And I'll say, yeah, look, that's right, but he's not here. You're the only one here with me at the moment. And I can only play with whoever turns up. What do you think you can do that's going to make a difference? Now, the interesting point about asking, often people go, I can't do anything. What could I do? And so I might say to them, well, tell me a few good things about you. And they can't. I can think of some good things about you. When you ask that question, what can you do? It's a challenge, but it's also an expression of confidence in the person. It builds them up because I think you can do something. So does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so. And probably just a follow-up question. In that scenario where you were talking about trying to resolve where you've got two people in a situation where the behaviour's been inappropriate, when you're using these questioning techniques, do you ever ask questions to help the individual gain insights into potentially their own behaviour as well?
Yeah,
Or want them to tell their story in its completeness first?
yeah, I like to get them to tell their story in its completeness, and then start to then go back to clear things up. The interesting thing is, before I'm going to bring two people together, that I generally spend a lot of time with them, and I use the questions first. I question them using those questions so that they know what I'm about, and we've been able to have a conversation. That way, when I bring everyone together, I don't get a lot of I don't get surprises. And can I just give you an example there? A number of years ago, I got approached by a mother, and her daughter had been pack raped. And the circumstances were such, and I made a few inquiries, the coppers were never going to catch the bad guys. And I actually knew the family. I knew them from many years ago. And the interesting thing was that what had happened, all the relationships within the family, the mother was a number of brothers and sisters, and the relationships had all broken down. And when I went through it with mum, like when the young woman, mum talked to me, she said that, she was so disappointed with her brothers on why was that all? They didn't rally round and help. And then when she brought a daughter in, the daughter plainly wasn't that keen about being there. So I said, look, if mum wants you and I to have a chat. And mum was there, and she said, and I said, you're not real happy about that? And she said, well, no, I'm not. I said, right, what are you not happy about? She said, well, I don't want to talk about it. And I said, well, let's not talk about it. Let's talk about what's happened since. And she was a bit surprised, but she thought that was a good idea. Now, the interesting thing was when I was asking her, questioning her, I didn't go into what happened. I go, how's this impacted on you and others? And she told me the story about her mum and all the family relationships had broken down. So then I went and spoke to everyone else in the family. And in the end, we came together, and there was about 25, 26 people there. Her uncles and aunties, grandparents, mum and dad, brothers and sisters, cousins. And when I went through it, instead of starting with her, I started with the brothers about, what did you think when you realised this had happened? How's it impacted on you and others? What's the hardest thing? Now, the brothers were all, like, I'm a big guy. The brothers were as big as me and bigger. And listening to them, her uncles, talk about their anger and outrage and absolute distress for her that this had happened. And how's this impacted on you and others? It's been so hard. And what's the hardest thing? They all talked about how they didn't know what to do. They thought it was best left to women, so they didn't rally round. And they wished they could have, but they didn't know what to say. Now, by the time I got through the whole family and then came back to the girl, the really interesting thing was she felt the love, and her mother felt the love of the whole family. And what they realised was people didn't know how to engage around this dreadful stuff and this dreadful thing that had happened. Now, the funny part was afterwards, they sort of had a barbecue and everything. After about an hour, I realised they were all doing well. So I just left the family, said my goodbyes. About 4 months later, I was at a show, agricultural show, walking along with my wife, and the next minute saw this young woman, and she was with a number of other girls. And so I didn't make eye contact or anything, but the next thing, she came running up to me. She said, Matt, how are you? I said, oh, hey, how are you? It's lovely to see you. And then she turned around to the girls and she said, this is the man I told you about that helped me, that helped us. Now, all I'd done was work on applying Tompkins theories, the framework and the questions. I'd use the questions that Terry O'Connell and others developed in a very deliberate way. And what it enabled was to maximise the positive affect for her and minimise the negative affect. Does that answer your question? Sorry.
It does. Thank you. Do you go into so for us, we're not going to have those questions committed to memory yet. Would it still flow okay if you had those questions written down?
Oh, but can I tell you a funny story about that? I was running a training one time and introduced the questions, and the training was in Sydney, and there was people from all over doing it. And we came in the next day, and we were checking in, and one guy said, he said, "You're not going to believe what happened last night." He said, "I'm staying with my brother and his wife," and he said, "My sister started talking about some argument she'd had with one of her friends, and she was really distressed." And he said, I thought, gee, wow. So he said to her, he sort of had the card out underneath the table. He said, well, what happened again? And she told him. And he said, well, what did you think when you realised that was happening? And she said, oh, it was awful. You know, like he says, and how's it affected you? And she said that. And he said, what's the hardest thing? She said, she's one of my most wonderful friends. And he said, then she stopped for a minute and she said, hang on a minute, you're reading something. And he thought, oh, hang on. And he pulled it out and he went, oh, sorry, I've been doing this course. And yeah, I was just asking those questions. And she said, well, I don't know what they are, but gee, I feel so much better now. And everyone burst out laughing. So, you know, like that was the impact it had. There's nothing wrong with having these let down. And I'm quite happy to organise to send these cards to anyone, or you can use the, you know, like you can get a copy of the all the plates from today. That's no problem at all.
Matt, sorry, can I just say something? My name's Magdron from the Maitland Newcastle Diocese, and we support victims of sexual abuse within the diocese. And I just wanted to go back to that first question, asking what did you do? I think it's, and I'm wondering if you agree, but I think it's dangerous to ask a victim or a survivor, what did you do? Because the dynamics of sexual assault are that people blame themselves. So that would trigger someone into thinking that they're being blamed for whatever they did to make it happen. So I would reframe that question in maybe saying, how did you respond? Or maybe not even say that question to a victim of sexual assault.
Oh, no, can I put it to you? The question, what did you do? That only applies to people who've done the wrong thing.
Yeah, that's
Sorry,
what
I hadn't made that clear. So if you just to hold this up, there's questions on one side that are about responding to somebody who's behaved inappropriately. The questions on the other side are how we respond to somebody who's been harmed. And I would never ask somebody who'd been harmed, well, what did you do?
I just wanted to emphasize that. But I also think it's fantastic that, I think within the culture, people are very scared of emotions and very scared to talk to people, especially survivors, because of the emotions that might come out. And it's, fantastic, the message that you're saying.
Oh, thanks very much. Look, you know, like I just want to go on to that a bit. One of the things that, you know, the Royal Commission talked about, and we've been trying to do for years, is an apology. You know, get someone, a bishop or a congregational leader or somebody to come along and apologise. Now, well, that's, well-meaning and a great idea. When I've done that, when I've focused on sessions like that, I run them using the questions. by asking, instead of just somebody intoning an apology, I give the person the opportunity to tell their story. But the other interesting thing, I remember dealing, and this has happened to me more than once. The young lady, the young woman I told you about, where I realised I was talking to the child, and I remember putting to her, I said, look, the Archbishop would be, very, very, he's well aware of this, and he's supportive of everything here, and he's got you in his prayers, and he would very much like to talk to you and apologise to you. And she said to me, oh, look, Matt, that'd be nice, but it doesn't have to happen. You're someone in the church. And I said, well, actually, I'm not really anyone. She said, yes, but you've heard my story, you've responded, and action's been taken. And no, thanks very much, Matt. I'm really happy. And I remember another one where I responded to it and engaged the person in this same way. And when I came to, I said, well, the bishop would be very happy to talk to you. Oh no, he doesn't need to do that. I'm happy with where it's at. Now, can I just tell you one other thing when we're going on to that? I dealt with a matter a little while ago for a very small church. And it was not a Catholic church, but it was a matter that came through the National Redress Scheme. And we got asked to have a look at it. And we had a look at it, and I had to get, it was a complaint from about over 20 years ago, and it alleged sexual assault. And anyway, I went, we had to take it to the coppers. In the end, the person didn't want to go to the coppers, so the cops were happy enough not to pursue it. I interviewed the person and used this technique. Now, the poor guy had a backstory that would make you weep. But I went through it, then investigated, spoke to the person who was accused, spoke to a number of witnesses who were there, even interviewed. There was a range of work that we did to address it. And in the end, I formed the opinion, or came to the conclusion, that something certainly happened to this guy, but it wasn't the person he accused, nor was it anyone associated with him. Now, the guy was really hard to get. He struggled at a whole lot of levels. And when we finished, I tried to contact him, couldn't get him. And in the end, just completed the report and everything and sent it back. And spoke with the church leader and organised everything to go back to the redress scheme. But about 6 weeks later, the young fella rang me, or this fella rang me, he's a man now, he rang me and said, oh, Matt, you've been trying to get me. I said, yeah, mate, yeah. And he said, what do you want? I said, well, I wanted to tell you that I finished the job. He said, oh, that's good. Thanks very much. And I said, so I just want to tell you the outcome. He said, yeah. I said, well, look, mate, I'm absolutely convinced that something happened to you. But what I can tell you, it wasn't him. It wasn't, nor was it anyone associated with him. And he, I've had to have that conversation before, and it can be a difficult conversation. But he went, oh, thanks very much, Matt. I said, are you sure you're right? He said, yeah, mate. He said, that's great. He said, my memory mightn't be what it was, but you listened to me and you believed me, and he did admit, he told me one lie, like when I was talking to him, that was part of the report. But in the main, things did happen to him. And I said to him, and he said to me, you believed me, you listened to me, and you believed me. And he said, the fact I didn't get everything right, he said, thanks very much for what you've come up with, but just having you believe me, he said, that was the most wonderful thing. Now, I don't know who harmed him, but somebody did. But it wasn't the person he accused. But just the way I had engaged him he felt, he told me he felt really wonderful about it because he was believed. Does that sort of answer your question?
Well, while they're pulling themselves together, Matt, it's Kendra here. We've got a couple of questions in the chat that have come through, but I also know that we've got more slides to come. So
no, I've actually finished the slides now.
You have finished the slides? Well, then I'll stop sharing. That's great. So thank you. So can I redirect a couple of the questions from the chat then to you?
Yeah, sure.
There are two that are very similar, which is one from Jonathan Bradford and one from Ursula, about culture and the impact that cultural background has on shame, and that some cultures are more shame-based than others. And Ursula's do you have any observations about how shame manifests itself in different cultures?
Yeah. Shame actually exists in a whole lot of cultures. And can I just preface that question with an observation that shame, when my dear old doggy was alive, shame used to keep him alive. See, shame is the affect that interrupts us feeling good, or interrupts the positive affects. Now, when I go out for a walk with my dear old dog, and he'd scare up a rabbit or something, and he'd be very interested and very excited, and he'd be rushing after the rabbit. And the rabbit, strangely enough, didn't want to play. So it'd run away and it'd jink one way and jink another way, and it'd get a bit further away from him. And shame would occur and his muscles would start to lose muscle tone. He couldn't run as quick. And then it'd get further away from him and his head would drop, he'd lose interest and go off and do something else. Dogs respond very well to shame. Now, shame is demonstrated in different cultures in many different ways. If we look at sort of the British stiff upper lip, something that, like we exhibit, shame is, shame we tend to suppress it in a lot of ways. Other cultures express it in different ways. I'll give you an example of how different cultures address it. If you went to a rugby league game or an NRL game or an AFL game, it can be a real tight game, but the crowd's a mix of spectators who support both sides. If we look at a European soccer game or a British soccer game, the supporters are kept apart. They're not even allowed to walk the same way to the ground. So what's violence? Tompkins argued that, or Nathanson argued that all violence owes its origins to shame. He said, so a fight in the playground's about shame. September 11, he argued, was about endemic shame. Now, if we look at the way people respond to shame, in different cultures, it gets responded to in very different ways. Let's have a look at, say, some of the tribal fighting that's going on in New Guinea. They express shame directly, quite violently. We can look at some of the stuff that's going on around politics, the invective that gets directed at opposition supporters or opposition politicians, or by both sides or by the various different sides. Shame, for example, in Japanese culture that's what harikari's about. Shame, if you look at the Asian cultures, for example, look, a very interesting thing there. I read some research a while ago that said that it was looking at air crashes. And if you look, for example, there was a crash in Japan a while ago where one engine failed and the pilot responded by turning off the engine that was still going. And what was put out from some research that was done around it was that Asian crews, and I'm not having gone to Asians, I'm just looking at the way shame operates in the culture. Asian crews are more likely to see something going wrong and go, well, she's the pilot, she knows what she's doing, or he is, and not say anything. Whereas a Western crew are going to go, mate, what are you doing? And so that you can see that. And so we'll often find, I did some work for the Sierra Malabar epic a while ago. And what I had to address is the way, I was around domestic violence, but what I realised I was addressing different ways that shame is dealt with within the different communities. Does that answer the question?
I certainly think it does, Matt, but no, but I wasn't the person who asked the question. So I'm going to move on to the next question, if you don't mind,
Yeah,
which
that's
is from David, who says, can you please tell us the different questions on the two sides of the cards? The questions for someone who's been harmed and the questions for someone who's acted in a harmful way.
the question for somebody is who's acted in the wrong way. What happened? What were you thinking about at the time? What have you thought about since? Who's been affected by what you did? What do you think needs to happen to make things right? The question for somebody who's been impacted by shame is, what happened? How, hang on a minute, I'll just get myself right here. What happened? What did you think? Well, not so much what happened. What did you think when you realised what had happened? How's this impacted on you and others? What's been the hardest thing for you? And what do you think needs to happen to make things right? Now, just to go to the first set of questions, with a mate of mine named Bill Curry, I used to run a traffic offender program. And Bill and I used to ask, it was mainly young men in the program, some young women and some older people, mainly young blokes. And you go, so when everyone was there, we had to get them to tell us what happened, but they had to do it telling us, okay, what happened? What were you thinking about at the time? Oh, I was a bit pissed, but I thought I'd be right to get home. What have you thought about since? Well, I was an idiot. Who's been affected by what you did? Well, I didn't hit anyone, but anyway, the boss had to drive me around for a while and, oh, right. What do you think you need to do to make things right? Well, I'm not going to do it again. And so we just let them all go through it and then say, mate, what did mum say when you got home? And they'd go, oh, I've never heard the end of it. Like, oh, she's always at me. Like, what do mums get so cross with us when we do stupid stuff like this? And we'd let the question float around for a while. And somebody'd say, well, they're worried you're going to do it again. Or they just go, they're just worried. And then you go back, but you told me that no one was affected by what you did. And we'd go in the room, looking around, the whole heads would drop. Oh, being open in this way gives them an insight. And the questions, use these questions, and then there is some follow-up you can do using your own experience. But why do we ask thinking questions? The reason we ask thinking questions is because if you ask someone, well, mate, how'd you feel? Oh, awful. It's difficult to take that somewhere. If you ask them, what did you think? They'll tell you how they felt, only they'll express it more broadly. So the reason we ask thinking questions is to allow people to express emotion. So, like I'll give you, when you sit down and talk to somebody about that, mate, what happened at a judiciary, mate, what happened? Oh, well, I did this and did that. And so they're telling you their story. What were you thinking about? Oh, I was really angry. Yeah. What have you thought about since? Oh, well, I'm an idiot, mate. Like, I shouldn't have done it. Like, who's been affected? Well, my kids were watching. You actually start to get, it helps them actually process what happened. sometimes when you go to the other question, I remember talking to a boy who had been suspended from a school, and the school asked me to go and talk to his dad, and they said, when you talk to his dad, you'll hate him, because we do, but you realise why his kid's the way he is. So I went to see the dad, and he's at home with the boy, and I went in, and even as I was walking in, up to the front door, he was there giving it to me. And so I just let him talk and waited till there was a break in the traffic. And I said, mate, what did you think when I had to become involved in this? Yeah, he said, bloody school and the teachers, they're always that, and now they got you involved in it. So I just let him go. And I said, mate, how's this impacted on you and the rest of the family? And he said, oh, and he started to tell me this boy's from his first relationship, and his behaviour's all over the place, and you know, and he went on for a while. I let him finish, and I said, mate, what's the hardest thing? And this is a big, tough bloke. And he said, he started to cry. He said, it's turning out just like me, and I didn't want that to happen. But the poor bugger had no idea what was going to make a difference. Now, for a whole range of reasons, we didn't get a real good results. But the guy said to me later, he said, you know, you're the first person who's ever cared what it's like for me. So, you know, that's what's useful about this set of questions. Sorry, I've gone on a bit.
No, I'm moving to the next question because I'm very aware of the time, if you don't mind, Matt, much as it's really fascinating. Vera has asked, what happens when the offender is not willing to acknowledge their behaviour? How does the victim get closure?
Well, here's the thing. You see, most of the time when you're doing this stuff, often the victim's dead. Sometimes they're not owning anything. But when we give, like, for example, remember I told you the story about that young, that young girl who'd been raped? She got tremendous closure. When I told you the story about the young woman who was offended against by a priest, the priest wasn't having anything. The priest wasn't having anything. No, didn't do anything wrong. And but she got absolute closure out of it. So if we depend on the bad guy, if you like, fessing up to everything to get closure, you know, we're setting ourselves impossible goals. What we do when we respond to people in a way that validates their story by allowing them to tell it, that engages them at an emotional level, that actually connects with them by doing that, so that we can give them the opportunity to express and reduce the negative affect, and through doing that, increase positive affect. We're never going to be able to change the past, and we can't just go back to normal, but we can help people get to a new normal. We can help people recognise that this is where I'm at, that my experience has been validated, I've been heard. And in reality, that's all we can offer.
And I think that links into the next question, Matt, because David has said, whilst we always need to have a trauma-informed approach, is there a risk in us using therapeutically focused questions with victim survivors in disclosure interviews, where the purpose is to obtain the details of the alleged abuse rather than therapy as such, and where the interviewer is is trained as an investigator, not a counsellor, psychologist, therapist? Do we need to be careful? Sorry, the end of it. Do we need to be careful that a trauma-informed approach to interviews of victim survivors focuses on obtaining disclosure details, doesn't cross over into therapy?
Can I tell you that, you know, I've got a fair bit of experience around the criminal world. None of those questions would invalidate any evidence. To ask someone the question that says, you know, what happened? that's a straight out question. They can tell you the answer. What if we say to somebody then, what did you think when you realised this was happening? We're simply going into it more. We're allowing them to tell us the story. How's this impacted on you and others? That's a valid part of any investigation. And what's the hardest thing? We get to the harm that's been done. Like, if we're investigating stuff like this, part of our job is not to be solely for just the facts, Mum. It's not about that. It's about engaging the person and allowing them to tell their story. Now, nothing in those questions invalidates anything, and anyone can ask the questions. Allowing people to express emotion is an important part of our engagement with other people. I've only been using these questions for more than 20 years. And admittedly, I've got some other training and qualifications. But I've given these to loads of people over the years, and I can't see, like, I would argue that enabling a person to express the emotion is better for them than asking them for facts without allowing them to express emotion. And what I've seen is the impact it makes on people, because when we're investigating something, yes, we've got to be fair, we've got to be scrupulously fair to both the person accused and the person who's making the complaint and anyone else who happens to be involved. But none of this gets in the way of scrupulous fairness and fair process. And bear in mind, when you're talking to somebody who has done the wrong thing, when you're talking to somebody who's done the wrong thing, allowing them to express emotion is also important. You know, like, some people do the wrong thing and they are genuinely sorry. Now, to enable them to express the emotion is equally important. Does that answer the question? Would you like to discuss it more? Like, I'm happy to talk more about it.
David has said thank you, so I think that means that you've answered his questions. But Matt, I'm going to wind us up now, if you don't mind, because Albano, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but Albano's put in the message. Thank you, Matt. It's been a most informative webinar, and most of all, I like the way you have engaged us today. Brilliant indeed. Thanks again. And I completely concur with that, Matt. It has been a fascinating and really thought-provoking conversation, but it's also been practical, and we appreciate that. You've provided us lots of thoughts and ideas, and I'm sure it's going to help us all better safeguard children and adults at risk. So thank you.
Thanks very much.